I think one of the tragic uh, trends in modern life is that the church has embraced the values of the culture. The values of the culture are 64% of Americans, for example, say there's no such thing as truth, absolute truth. 53% of evangelicals say the same thing. So that those of us who claim to be born again, serious Christians, taking our Bible seriously, reading it literally, believing that it instructs and informs our lives, can't possibly believe there's no such thing as truth when Jesus says, I am the truth. All ultimate reality is in the Logos. In the beginning was the Word with God. The Word was God. The Word, the Greek word that's used, that's translated as Word, is Logos, which means all reality, everything that can ever be known. How can you believe Jesus is who he says he is and live in the postmodern mind, postmodern world? You can't. You've got to see that there's an absolute thesis and antithesis, and we can't cross that divide.
Is it you in one of your books? I think it is. Maybe it was Yancey. I'm not sure. But the point was, God goes where he's wanted. How wanted are those 53? How wanted is God by that 53% of evangelicals who
Well,
aren't sure there's absolute truth?
I don't think they can be. I don't think he can be really wanted by them. They're paying respects to him. They go to church. They figure they're doing their religious duty. They look good in society. Nice thing to get dressed up on Sunday morning. That's not being a Christian. A Christian is, Bonhoeffer put it very well, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Great book out by my friend Eric in Texas.
I interviewed him on it.
Oh,
Yeah, it's a great book.
Eric started to work for me when he got to Yale. He came to a meeting once and asked a great question. He's a fabulous guy, and that's a great book.
Yeah.
And people need to read it today because the cultural conditions in the West are not as different as we'd like to think from Germany in the 1930s. But Bonhoeffer said in a book he wrote called Cost of Discipleship, which I read when I was in prison, when Christ calls, he bids a man to come and die. And unless you're prepared to die to yourself, you're going to have trouble calling yourself a Christian.
My son-in-law just died in the work of the Lord in Africa.
I'm sorry, your son-in-law
My son-in-law just died.
just died?
Just died, yeah.
Oh,
Just a few months ago. As he was working for the Lord in Africa, I know exactly what you're talking about there. It's one thing to speak of it as an academic thing. It's another thing to experience it. So I have a 32-year-old widow living with me and 3 little fatherless kids. But he sought to do the will of the Lord and in the process lost his life. But speaking of Africa, I was just there. I work in Africa. I just did 3 days conference with 1,800 young people in Malawi. There's no postmodernism there. I'm wondering, I'm wondering, is it a function of education? Is it a function of materialism? Is it something else? I mean, here's 1,800 kids who have this very real sense of right and wrong, of evil and goodness, of hell and heaven, and they fear the darkness.
The most refreshing thing in the world is to go to the third world, where people have not been indoctrinated in sophisticated, so-called postmodern, ultimately tolerant thought that there is no truth. I know I asked one African pastor once when I was with him, I said, do you have any trouble here teaching that there is such a thing as truth? He said, of course not. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I put my life on the line preaching here in a country that's got a heavy Muslim population. He said, I wouldn't give my life for something that wasn't the truth. Now, they get it.
Yeah.
The problem is we're sucked into a culture. But the thing you got to understand is, what is culture? Culture is nothing except the habits and dispositions of the people that is created by the cult, the belief system. So when the belief system is strong, as it is in the global South and the Christian faith, the culture reflects that. The problem in the West today is that we have been decaying and drawing inward as a church at the very time when Christian influence is most needed in society. So we're seeing the culture decay around us. And as Christians, we're naively saying, well, wait for the next election, we'll straighten everything out. It's not a question of elections, it's a question of the culture. Politics is an expression of the culture. Politics is sick in the West today. It's the culture. And that's the cult. So that's us.
Are you surprised that there may be as many believers in China today as there are in the United States of America?
No, I think in actual count, if you looked at the Chinese church, which is somewhere between 80 and 100 million, depending on the estimate, some people say 120, there probably are more true Christians in China than there are in the United States. And I'm not surprised at all because they've had to pay a price for their faith.
Yeah. What it's an irony, isn't it? That the more pressure on the community of faith, the faith thrives.
It's been the case for 2,000 years.
Yeah.
It's not any different today. And what we think about as grace becomes often cheap grace,
Yeah.
as Bonhoeffer put it again, to quote him. It has to be costly grace. It has to cost you everything, or you're not going to respect. If you get something for free, do you really treat it well? No. You can throw it away. But if you have to give your life for something, you fight to the end for it.
What has ministry to the prisoner done to you personally?
Well, it's totally transformed me because I've been surrounded by the most powerless people in the world. I also have an autistic child in my family, a grandson whom I love dearly, who would be eliminated by the eugenicists, which are back in our midst and active and talking loudly, weeding out the defectives, the curse that comes upon us when we stop respecting life in every stage. But to be among the prisoners, I've kind of absorbed their view of life. You see life differently from the underside of society. From the bottom of society looking up when I was in prison, you see something very different than you do when you're in the top side of society looking down. And you never quite forget it. You'll never get over the experience of losing your son. And tragic though it is, God will use that in powerful ways with you. You asked me about power corrupting. Absolutely. Power corrupted me, absolutely, in the White House, and could again today with ease. I recognize that. The only thing that keeps me from it today is that I spend so much time with people who are powerless and disenfranchised that I can't shake their point of view. And I kind of know it's real because somebody will come to me, as people do at this conference, and say, "Oh, you're such a hero of mine." And I cringe. I absolutely, literally cringe because I know I'm not. I mean, I know who I am.
You were chief counsel to Richard Nixon. Did Watergate affect your view of him at all, or were you a band of brothers and you all knew everything about each other as it related to that whole situation?
Well, the White House is never a band of brothers, even when it looks like that from the outside.
No.
Everybody walks with their back to the wall because if I get FaceTime with Nixon, as I used to have it in and out of his office all the time, it's the night of the long knives. Everybody's out to cut you down. So it is dog eat dog in the White House. There's no camaraderie. I came out of the Marine Corps experience where there's a real bonding, semper fidelis. You're loyal, faithful. It was nothing like that in the White House, and there hasn't been in any White House that I've had any experience with. Bush came closer to it than most people, and the reason is power drives the whole process. So you don't want to see somebody else succeed. You want to succeed at their expense.
You're chief counsel for President Nixon. Your office is right next to his. In the pecking order, I mean, you're one of the most powerful guys in the world.
Top half a dozen in the White House, right?
Yeah, yeah. How does it happen that a group of the most powerful men in the world can drift into this gray area?
Drift is a very good word because nobody consciously starts
No.
out and says, "I'm going to obstruct justice." It's crazy. And I was trained, and this is a good lesson for all of us. I was trained by a dad who was very puritanical. He was going to law school nights. I'd only see him on Sunday afternoons, but he would sit down with me and say, "Chuck, never tell a lie. You won't get in trouble if you don't tell a lie. Always tell the truth. Do an honest day's work for an honest day's pay and save money." I mean, I heard the Christian work ethic drilled into my head. My dad was not a believer, a Christian as I would now understand it. He was a cultural Christian. He lived on the heritage of the Christian teaching. But I went to the White House and left a law firm that I was making a lot of money for those days in the late 60s. And I put everything in a blind trust, and I told my law partners, "Don't come see me in the White House. I'm not going to talk to you." I would get gifts at Christmas. I'd take them down to the switchboard operators or the driver of my limousine. I never thought I could be compromised. And that's when you're most vulnerable. Pride creates self-righteousness. And I discovered that human beings have the infinite capacity for self-rationalization. And the only way you can avoid that is accountability with other people. If you have a commitment to Christ in your life, it's going to help a lot because it's going to keep you on your knees some days and you don't think you're the one running the world after all. Or at least you're sobered enough to realize that. But the human tendency is the harder you try to do everything right, the more likely you're going to do something wrong because you're taking pride in it. I used to say nobody could ever compromise me. I went to jail. The lesson is that the human will is rebellious. The Apostle Paul laments in Romans 7, why is it that I know what is right and I do what is wrong? And that's the human dilemma. And he wrote that as a believer. We're all vulnerable. And only when you realize that, and only when you're dependent on others and when you hold yourself accountable to someone who will hold you in account, are you going to be safe from that innate drift. You end up doing the wrong thing when you thought you were righteous about doing the right.
The culture of power. You know, a lot of things you can keep in the shadows because it's national security, right? You can live in the shadows and you can justify it. But at what point does the culture of power creep into your soul and begin to compromise, who at your core you believe you really are?
The day you arrive in the White House, for example, and people start saluting you and you're given a limousine and all of a sudden you've got all this power, you think it's a perception of power, because you really don't have that much power. You think you do, and people are constantly saying, "Oh, what great responsibilities you have." And you're puffed up all the time. If I didn't go to parties, I didn't like the social circuit in Washington, never did. But once or twice or 3 times, 4 times I went for a particular reason, and you got ambassadors fawning all over you and the press clamoring around you. I can see how this could tip a person over the edge. It did me, in the sense that while I thought I was protected against it, I wasn't. Again, you need an accountability structure in your life.
You know the old adage, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Is that true?
Yes. Lord Acton was absolutely right. That was one of the great insights in human behavior. Power makes you think you can accomplish anything. And modesty and humility come when you know that you can't, that you're living on the heritage of those who have gone before you. That's really the essence of being a conservative. A conservative wants to preserve the moral order and believes he lives by the teaching of the past and by revealed truth, not by his own wits. That drives you to your knees, and a Christian has to believe that. A Christian has to be a conservative in his disposition on life because he's living by revealed truth.
Can a conservative be a Democrat?
Sure. Conservatism is a disposition.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about ideology now.
Right.
Left and right.
Yeah.
I kind of dispense with both because they're both ideological positions, the left and the right. But I do believe that a conservative temperament, a conservative disposition, the way conservatism has historically been understood, is very important for you to keep in perspective who you are and your relationship with God, which flows naturally as a Christian, and then a recognition of your own inadequacy.